So, hi everybody. Welcome to the Sleeping with Steve podcast. This is a podcast that's designed to help you fall asleep while listening to me, Steve. And this time I'll be telling you about historical events and occurrences that you may not know about. Maybe you do. But by the end of the show, you'll definitely have more insight on these events. And it's okay if you don't fall asleep, too. There's no pressure. I just want everybody to learn more about history and to take some time to relax. That's perfect. So today, you guys are part of something very special. This is the first official episode of Sleeping with Steve. And today, I'm going to be talking about the siege of the Branch Davidians compound near Waco, Texas, by federal agencies like the ATF, the FBI, Texas Rangers, and even the U.S. military. Now, I think this is a really interesting event, as it's often seen as one of the most intense and dramatic standoffs in American history. It's also pretty controversial in the tactics used by law enforcement to try to find a peaceful solution to the standoff. Waco is also seen as a case that emphasizes domestic issues such as religious freedoms, cults, gun rights, federal powers, inhumane treatment by the police, and many, many more. With all that being said, thank you for checking in to my podcast, and I hope that you all enjoy the content. Now that the intro's out of the way, I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about how the podcast is going to go. So, structurally, that is speaking. First, I'll do the intro, which kind of lets you know about what the topic is that I'll be speaking about. So today, it's Waco. Excuse me. And then I'll have this portion here that sort of acclimates listeners to the tone of the show, which is supposed to be sleepy in nature. So this will give the listeners a little bit of time to get ready, maybe get cozy. Maybe you're in bed right now. Maybe you're pretending to be in a Zoom class. Or you could just be walking on a treadmill in your basement, trying to learn more about the standoff that happened at Waco. And you want to take your mind off of the sound of the treadmill that's not working right now. You're going to have to call the mechanic, but it's not the best timing. So it really doesn't matter what you're doing, but I'm glad you're here. This portion of the show will go on for about 10 or 15 minutes, which includes the intro. So that should be enough time for you to set up your sleep station or brush your teeth maybe if you're a practicer of good dental hygiene. And another thing that I'd like to point out is that if you haven't noticed already, I may go on little tangents about things loosely related to the topic. And that's just to create sort of a conversational tone with you so it isn't too rigid. I really want you to learn more about the history of these events, but more importantly, I want you guys to relax and have a more restful sleep. And if listening to this podcast can help you achieve any of that, then I've done my job. Now, the reason I chose to do a podcast based on helping people relax and fall asleep while also speaking about historical events or occurrences in the past is that I personally listen to sleep podcasts when I can't fall asleep. And I also love history. One thing that I've noticed, though, that kind of connects the two things is that a lot of people really don't find history that interesting. Or if they do, but they always find that history is the class where it would put you to sleep the most. I had a friend named Eamon in high school, and probably 2 days out of every 4 days in class, Eamon would fall asleep in my AP US history class. And to this day, I'm thinking about you, Eamon. Shout out for helping be an inspiration on the podcast. And I just really want to help people relax. If that comes by way of audiobook, so be it. If that comes in a lecture in a 500-person hall at a Big Ten university, maybe, I could see that too. But what I'm offering is that same experience anywhere you go. I'm always going to be here. I'm always going to be one button away. You'll be able to find this podcast on YouTube or my SoundCloud. And I very much would appreciate it if you guys came out of this experience knowing a little bit more about history and telling your friends. I feel that history is one of those topics that doesn't get as much love as the others, like STEM. Now, no disrespect to the STEM majors out there, but I mean, you're all doing very important things with your sciences and your technologies and whatever E stands for, and math. Don't forget about the math. But after being a student for well over 10 years now, I can assure you I'm not very good at math, and that has driven me to the topic of history, which I find is very helpful, especially in today's climate, where there's a lot of crazy things going on, and even historical events occurring right now. I'm recording this right now during the quarantine, and maybe when this is over, I could do a video about the quarantine. Who knows? Maybe you guys would like that. Anyways, I really think that this is a good opportunity for not only me to expand my knowledge on these topics, as I obviously need to research them before I address you all via this podcast microphone, but I think it's also a good opportunity to just settle down and listen to stories that have great impact on politics and decisions that are made even today. Now, Waco is one of those events that you probably have heard of, but if you were called up to the front of the classroom, you might not. You might start developing a cold sweat whenever they ask you the in-depth questions about it, except for where did this take place, in which case you could always just say Waco and probably get the teacher off your back. But this is a very interesting event as it's starting to pick up popularity. It looks like I was just on Netflix last night, and I saw that there's a Waco miniseries. It looked like a dramatic retelling of the events, so you guys should check that out after listening to this and, see if who did it better. Netflix, the billion-dollar company, or me, the billion-dollar man. I'm just kidding. I'm sure it's very good, though. So, now it's time to get into the meat of the podcast. So, this is a moment that you've all been waiting for. Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines. This is the story of the siege that occurred at Waco, Texas, including some backstory and the aftermath from this wild occurrence. So to start off, I have a little what, who, when, where, why. And I know it's not in the typical who, what, when, where, why. For some reason, I swapped the who and the what. So, whose fault is that? What's going on? When did this happen? But to provide a little bit of backstory, the what is the siege at Waco, Texas. Who is the religious cult of the Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh. And the other parties include the FBI, the ATF, law enforcement, including the Texas Rangers, and factions of, well, not factions as much as, just people in the U.S. military were also called in. And this event took place the main event took place between February 28th and April 19th of 1993. And that being said, there was a lot of backstory leading up to this, and we'll get into it in a second, but it's very interesting about how deep some of the ties go in this case. Even 40 years before the actual incident, you're planting seeds that will turn into the chaotic flower that became Waco. So now we're at where, which is still in the right spot. That's Mount Carmel Center in Axtell, Texas, just 13 miles northeast of the town of Waco, Texas. And I know, you're gonna get mad and say, Steve, why do you keep saying that it's Waco, the siege of Waco, when it actually occurred 13 miles away in Axtell, Texas? And I'll just respond with, yeah, you're right about that. It's not in Waco. It's kind of a misnomer a little bit for the whole incident. However, in any capacity that you would find this in, you would read about it in a book that would say Waco Siege, not Axtell, Texas. But what you need to focus on is the Mount Carmel Center, and the why. The why is religious cult members wanted to establish themselves from the powers of the federal government and find their way to salvation under the second coming of Jesus Christ. So, in the mid-1950s, there was a religious group that emerged in central Texas. These people were known as the Branch Davidians. This religious group was founded on the prophecy that the end times was approaching and that Jesus would return to the earth, and alongside the Davidians, they would defeat the armies of Babylon. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to me, that's kind of a red flag. I'm all for you people supporting religions. There's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, who am I to say, like believe what you want to believe. That being said, if someone came up to me in the 1950s and said that we would need to defeat the armies of Babylon, I would be a little confused. Not only for the fact that, I'm in Texas. The Babylon's probably somewhere near, I don't know, Palestine? Somewhere in the Middle East. It's not very close to Texas. But not only that, but I'd say, with what army? What are the Babylonians? What do they want with me? I just live in Central Texas. So they rounded up enough people to create this Branch Davidians religious movement, and the original founder was a man named Victor Hewlett. I believe I'm pronouncing that right, but it looks kind of French, so you never know with the T's. So after the original founder, Victor Hewlett, died, and the prophecy that the world was ending in the mid-50s didn't quite work out, surprise, surprise, the leader of the group became Benjamin Roden, who was a founder of the Seventh-day Branch Davidian Adventist, which was a sect that would be known as the Branch Davidians eventually. So Benjamin moved his people to a compound called Mount Carmel. And that just goes to show, for any of you listening out there, it's Carmel, not caramel. Even the Branch Davidians know that. So 13 miles north of Waco, 13 miles northeast of Waco, they created a large community following where Roden and his family lived with this big community of followers. And after Benjamin died, his wife Lois was charged with finding the next successor to her husband, and she considered their son George to be unsuitable for the position, and she, as a result, began to groom a man named Vernon Howell to be the next leader of the Branch Davidians. Over the next few years, Vernon and George would have little skirmishes and disputes over the differences in their religion and what direction that they thought that the Branch Davidians should go after George left the group and kind of split it up and started his own little following. So, in 1984, George Roden and his followers drove to George Roden and his followers drove Vernon Howell and his supporters from the compound at Mount Carmel, and Howell settled in Palestine, Texas for the time being. Now, this is where it gets confusing, because now that Vernon Howell settled his movement in Palestine, Texas, maybe I can understand a little bit more about why everyone was so concerned with the Babylonians coming and fighting them, considering that Palestine was in our backyards and no one had any idea. But now that Vernon Howell had settled the area, I can understand why there could have been a bit of a miscommunication about the Babylonian army. So, in 1987, Lois Roden died, and her estate was probated, which resulted in Vernon Howell attempting to take over Mount Carmel by force. And as a result of this, George Roden dug up the grave of one of their followers and had challenged Vernon Howell to a resurrection off to see who was the real spiritual leader. However, Howell declined and instead tried to break into the compound to get evidence of this, of George Roden obviously tampering with a corpse. And, that when I read that part, it kind of stuck out to me. It's not every day that you could witness a resurrection off. And I think that that's something that's pretty special, if you think about it. Imagine if Howell would have accepted the challenge and lost to George Roden. Then what? Does George Roden become the spiritual leader of everything? I would pay a good $20 to watch a resurrection off right now, actually. They don't even need to resurrect anybody. I'd just like to see how they try to do it. Maybe with some ammonia. Maybe a little bit of cold water on the head. Who knows? So, after Howell and 7 others attempted to get evidence of Roden tampering with the corpse, they were promptly caught and a shootout ensued. So the police came and broke up the scene after both parties opened fire on each other for about 20 minutes. Welcome to Texas. And none of Howell's followers or himself were found guilty of anything. They were actually all acquitted, which was a little confusing to me, considering there was a shootout. But they were all acquitted, and Roden actually was held in contempt of court for his decorum in the courthouse, and as a result, he had some other issues and had to spend 90 days in jail. So, a little bit later, in mid-1989, Roden, the so-called spiritual leader, stable guy, ended up killing another Branch Davidian with an axe and was later placed in a mental hospital under the insanity defense. So, if that doesn't tell you where this is kind of headed, if you were Team Roden, I'm sorry that the journey was cut short a little bit. But now it appears that there's a big bandwagon for Mr. Vernon Howell and his faction, of Branch Davidians. And he appeared to be the one sole leader of the Davidians at this point. So, in 1989, Howell released an audio tape that claimed that God had commanded him to establish a House of David by having children with every woman in the group. And the men would remain celibate, and they would form an army for God to prepare for the end of days. You know, the craziest part so far to me isn't even the resurrection party or the Palestine actually being located in Texas or the Babylonian army. The craziest part to me is how Vernon Howell convinced these women to procreate with him, to create an army for God. And what's even crazier is that the men all remained celibate, because I can't imagine anyone, specifically a Texan, being told by a man that he was going to marry everyone's wives and he was the only one who would be able to have sex with them. It's a little concerning that so many people fell for it. But they did because Vernon Howell was so convincing as a spiritual leader and as a conduit to speak with God, which at the time was, it was nuts, because a lot of the people that have been running with Howell or even Roden had been second generation, third generation Branch Davidians, which means that these people were totally indoctrinated into the belief system, and that it wasn't so crazy that Vernon Howell would be creating an army of God and that he would need all the women and the men would get nothing. But that it would be all right because they'd be saved. So after this, Howell changed his name to David Koresh. Howell is now David Koresh. And then they sold most of their land, except for about 77 acres that made up the core compound. So, it was around 1992 when newspapers began to tell the story about Koresh and the Davidians and how they claimed to be the Messiah, and he had up to 140 wives and had at least a dozen children already at this point with his followers. So David was well on his way to creating his army for God. He's close to it. He's got about 2 squads. So during this time, these local newspapers started to cover the Davidians and Koresh a little bit more, and they really drew a little bit more activity to what was going on. And then around the same time, a UPS driver actually uncovered a package during one of his routes, and package bumped on the ground and it opened up. And what did he see? He found a lot of grenade casings, assault rifles that had pieces that were made to be modified into full auto machine guns, as well as black powder, cardboard tubes, just chemicals that are typically found in explosives. So in May of 1992, the police were notified about suspicious activity from the UPS driver. And so they contacted the ATF, who began an investigation and surveillance of what would include an undercover agent by the name of Robert Rodriguez being able to go into the compound, as well as staking out a house across the street that was kind of notoriously bad stakeout. The people there, the agents, were trying to pose as college kids. However, they were all in their 30s and they never went to class, and they just did a pretty poor job at hiding the fact that they were not college kids. They weren't even enrolled anywhere near there, so I think there's a pretty good idea that the Branch Davidians knew that they were being surveilled on. And why wouldn't you? I mean, if I had a stockpile of automatic weapons and explosives, I'd always be thinking that, the birds aren't real. They're surveilling me. But luckily I don't. So at this point, the ATF gets a search warrant on suspicion that the Davidians were modifying guns to be fully automatic. And how they would do that is they would take, don't try this at home, they would take the bottom receivers for AR-15s, which were legal semi-automatic rifles, and the top receivers for M16s, service-issued assault rifles. And you can actually attach the two and create a modified fully automatic gun. So they were stocking up on all these. And oh, by the way, I don't think I mentioned ATF. For those who don't know, is the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, which oversees things such as alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, which is why they are here in this David Koresh and Branch Davidian's case, is because of these guns, obviously. So more and more guns and explosives were continued to be sent to the compound, and it was also found out that the Davidians were working on, they would sell their guns to dealers or gun shops around the area. And they actually had a man who was a licensed federal arms dealer as part of the cult. And so they would get the appropriate paperwork, and then they would simply go to auctions, and they would all make a lot of money off of these guns that they were selling into the community. Now, it was also unclear at the time, but another way that they made money was potentially through narcotics distribution. Later I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's suspected that there was a large meth lab located in the compound that helped the Davidians actually fund their purchases, considering that they didn't really have regular jobs, I suppose. So a local farmer heard automatic gunfire, including a .50 caliber machine gun. And when the authorities went and interviewed this man, he appeared to be a credible witness. He did a tour in overseas. I'm not sure how old this farmer was. Could have been Vietnam. Maybe he went to do some dirty work down in South America. Maybe Desert Storm. I think that, Desert Storm happened by 1992. So Yeah, maybe it was Desert Storm. But anyways, this farmer heard these automatic gunfires and the 50 cal machine gun, and this was another thing that gave authorities to, pause and reflect and say, hey, we know that this Koresh, we know that this guy's kind of crazy, and he's got a large compound filled with devout followers who would do anything, and they're looking for salvation, and they think that the end times are near. So, maybe we should check into this a little bit more. They already had the surveillance up and everything, but you never want to hear 50 cal machine gun anywhere near you. So finally, after all this, an agent got permission to go in and speak with Koresh, and she asked him point blank if they had all these weapons in the compound, and Koresh said no, but before I give you this tour, give us 30 minutes to kind of, tidy up a little bit. And she was all right with that. So about 30 minutes go by, and, she's going on this tour, and she looks down into a trap door. And in this trap door, she sees a refrigerator and a multitude of weapons, just modified assault rifles, handguns, shotguns. And the fridge was obviously seen by the agent as a target for them to practice on, given the size, the width of it, and I guess you could shoot a refrigerator and it wouldn't explode or anything. You wouldn't need to buy more than one, unless they were using the 50 cal, in which case I would call Kohler if my refrigerator got hit by a 50 cal. I don't think it would work. So she reported all this to her higher ups, and you know what? They said, screw this. We gotta get in there. We gotta get this guy. That's enough information for us. So Agent David Aguilera got an affidavit and a search and arrest warrants for Mr. Koresh, as well as a few others for the guns and some suspected child abuse, along with the potential distribution of drugs to supply the compound with income. This was proven, well, not proven, but they tried to prove it by thermal imaging, where they found hot spots over a location in the compound that seemed to indicate that there was a meth lab. And there was also a time when David was on recording saying that he encouraged the sale of drugs to help supply his movement with income. So the big thing is the drugs actually fulfilled a predicate that allowed the ATF to have access to military-grade equipment and training as it was part of the war on drugs. Ronald Reagan, I don't know if the war on drugs is still going on, but basically what happened was the ATF, for their raid, was only given communications and medical equipment and training. So it wasn't like they had a AC-130 waiting above, but they certainly got better equipment. So, on February 28th, the raid began under the Operation Showtime. And man, oh man, would it prove to be a show. So it kicked off at 9:45 when the ATF arrived in civilian cars, and officers hopped out in SWAT-style tactical gear. The thing is, the Davidians were actually tipped off about the raid because one of the agents asked a totally separate UPS driver for the address, and the guy happened to be David Koresh's brother-in-law. Imagine that. And no one knows how the shooting started. Somebody's got to know. But soon, both the ATF and the heavily armed Davidians were returning fire to one another. After about 45 minutes of intense fighting, ATF agents were able to get onto the roof and discover weapons caches, cakes, CACHES, and the ATF actually had to back off because they ran low on ammo, whereas the Davidians obviously had stockpiled mountains and mountains worth of ammunition for their mountains and mountains worth of guns. So there ended up being a ceasefire, and the Davidians allowed the ATF to remove the dead. So all in all, 4 agents were killed and 16 were injured, along with 6 of the Davidians. So, if you think that was crazy, get a load of this. After the first raid, the ATF and the FBI were able to contact Koresh and start negotiations. So David ended up giving phone interviews to the local news to try to tell his side of the story and, sway the public a little bit about how the federal government was coming in and disrupting the religious freedoms of United States citizens, which, it's First Amendment right. It's kind of a big deal, I guess, but the FBI decided to cut the communications off from the Mount Carmel compound, and for the next 51 days, they were unable to communicate with anyone on the outside, save for the team of 25 FBI negotiators. Woohoo. Can't wait to talk to them. And 51 days is a long time. I mean, quarantine at this point, it's been like 40-something days. But, at least I can talk to people. At least I can talk to you guys. So the negotiators managed to get 19 kids out, but there were still 98 people left in the compound. And Koresh had recently said that God had commanded him to stay inside and wait, despite the FBI negotiators feeling like they were getting a little bit of headway, and they thought that they would be able to get everyone out. So it's noted that the FBI became more and more aggressive in wanting to assault the compound. There were actually 2 factions working on the case here that split up within the FBI, similar to what happened with Roden and Howell, or Koresh and the Davidians, where one faction of the FBI wanted to negotiate as far as they could and get everyone out. and another was becoming increasingly anxious and wanting to assault the compound because it was costing millions of dollars per week to do the siege and just have people out there with their military vehicles. It was just crazy. And so the FBI resorted to some kind of crazy tactics. So what they did was they set up giant loudspeakers like at a concert, and they did sleep deprivation on the cult members by blasting pop music, sounds of jets flying in the air, the sound of rabbits being killed, which I suppose that I've never heard it, but I guess it's like a shrieking noise. And that doesn't sound very sweet to listen to, especially if you're trying to catch some Z's, especially not as nice as it would be to listen to this podcast if you're feeling sleepy. And another thing that the FBI did was they cut off the water and power to the compound in order to try to drive the Davidians out. But it didn't work. A group of 11 were eventually ordered to leave by David Koresh, and the tactics became more and more intense. So Koresh had begun to claim that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ, and that the FBI was worried about a potential mass suicide like what happened in 1978 in the Jonestown incident, which I may get into a little bit later. But finally, there was a final assault on Mount Carmel, and basically what happened was on April 19th, 1993, the FBI hostage rescue team and their military-grade combat vehicles went up to the compound, and because of the Davidians being so heavily armed, they were able to access these troop carriers and these tanks after Koresh threatened to have the capabilities to destroy all of the domestic vehicles. So there were some Abrams tanks, there were some CEVs, which are combat engineering vehicles, and some of you, when you think about military vehicles, you see that they look like tanks. So we could just say tanks. So what they did was they drove these massive troop vehicles up to the compound, and they would punch holes through the outside walls and drive around in these vehicles, smashing the cars of the cult members, driving over their graves, and just, being pretty ridiculous. But they would smash holes into the walls, and they began to pump tear gas into the compound. Now, this was allowed after they went up bureaucratically all the way up to President Clinton, and Clinton said, we just got to get this done. If you feel that this is the right thing to do, you should do it. They had no intention of firing on them. They were just going to use tear gas to push them out. So During this time, they had loudspeakers going on that were telling the cult members that there wasn't going to be an armed assault, and please don't fire on our vehicles. Love the FBI. So, according to documents, the hostage teams were able to get up to the building, and they would then fire a 40 millimeter gas grenades. They call them CS grenades. So very early in the morning, they fired 2 of these rounds into the construction site. And basically, they began to start just pumping it more and more with the gas. And the issue was some of these rounds that they were using were military-grade pyrotechnic incendiary gas rounds. That's a lot of words to mean this is going to set something on fire. And basically, that's what happened. Let me check the timeline right here. Around 12 o'clock in the afternoon, there were I believe it was 3. There were 3 fires that started in 3 separate locations in the compound. Nobody knows if they were caused by those pyrotechnic shells, which I had just talked about, or if they were set deliberately by the cult members, as there was a audio recording of them talking about, lighting the fire. Do you think I should light it soon? Get that fire going. So they're unsure of how the fire started. However, at this point, the gas stopped pumping in, and the fires were accelerated, which probably means that the Davidians were throwing gasoline on it. And a little bit later, there was a pretty massive explosion coming from inside of the compound. And at 12:25 p.m., there was a big explosion, and they said that part of the roof flew off and landed on a car. Around 5 minutes later, the whole building, or part of the roof, collapsed because of just the crazy amount of explosions and gunfire. Ooh, almost fell out of my chair. And gunfire, I'm getting excited about this case because of the massive fires in the building and the nearly 1.9 million rounds of ammunition and grenades and explosives in the building. What do you think's going to happen when it catches on fire? It's just like a fireworks show in there. So the fire department arrives, and as they're just cooking off live ammunition, the whole building collapses and the fire begins to burn out. And it's at this point that they go in and they search down and find that David Koresh, along with a multitude of other people, including his children, were buried under rubble or suffocated in the smoke, or they were part of a suicide by proxy or mercy killings, which basically means that they knew that there was no way out, and they had gas masks on and they had their supplies, they could have stood it out. However, with the fire and the explosions, it just got too much. As a result, 76 people died inside of there. Only 9 people left the building during the fire. And the FBI says that Steve Schneider, who was David Koresh's top aide, shot and killed David Koresh and then killed himself. There was also evidence of a 3-year-old who was stabbed in the chest as a mercy killing, and autopsy records showed that over 20 Branch Davidians were shot, which means that these were either suicides or suicide by proxy, or even forced execution. Now, that got a little heavy. So let's talk about the aftermath a little bit. So the aftermath to this case really is just that this was one of the most intense and most surreal events of the federal government having a showdown with private citizens, and specifically religious members. I think they were a cult. I think you can make up your own mind. However, I don't think it's a little out of the norm to say if someone says they're Jesus and that there's going to be a religious end of times and that you've got to follow them, it's fair to say it's a cult. But this leads to a lot of questions about how the federal government should handle things like this. It calls into question their tactics like the sleep deprivation and the cutting off of water and power, and the use of potentially. They never found any meth lab or anything, so there's always the question that they kind of lied to get their military vehicles and military support from the president by kind of feeding him a little bit of a different story. But that being said, the Branch Davidians definitely weren't good guys. They may have been misinformed, but they definitely were not the type of people that you would invite to the cookout. So, it just kind of leaves me with just the controversy of it, where, it just makes you wonder about, could the FBI do something to me if I do something crazy? Yeah, probably. So don't do anything crazy. Another thing, though, that I must say is that this event was actually a watershed watermark. It was a moment that basically led to the Oklahoma City bombing, which Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, he cited the Waco incident as his primary motivation. And that's not good, It's just kind of crazy that all these things are connected, and that, Waco was such a huge moment that started out because some dude in Texas with long hair thought he was the Messiah, But turns out in this country, the federal government's all the messiah you need. So, that about does it, guys. Thank you so much for coming in and listening to me today. I just want to thank you again and say I'll be back on Wednesday. Have a good night.